Think about this. Gender identity has become a massive topic over the past 10 years, maybe the biggest. At one point in September, even outpacing Google searches for information about the looming recession. What exactly is our obsession with transgender? How did it explode like it did? And why is it so polarizing? I think it's fair to call the transgender movement a major subculture, or a fad. Fads have good qualities and bad ones. In this episode, I'm going to try to prove to you that it is a fad, as well as propose some of the good things, as well as the bad things that have come from it. If you like these conversations, hit the like and subscribe buttons. My name is Chris, and this is the Think Report. Remember a few episodes back when I was canceled by a research company when I tried to perform transgender research? Well, I was looking through research by Pew, and it turns out that they've surveyed similar questions to what I was asking. According to a Pew Research study, 60% of Americans believe that a person's gender is determined at birth. However, the way they worded this survey allows someone to separate the meaning of gender and sex. If someone believes that gender is a social construct, someone would be able to postulate that a man can be a female gender while still maintaining a male sex. I would bet if they tweaked the question to, can a man transition to a real woman, the percent of people who say no would be much higher. So it's not exactly the question I wanted answered, but it'll do for the purposes of this episode. The thing that's interesting about this chart is that between 2017 and 2022, the number of people who believe that someone can be a different gender than their sex at birth is decreasing. That's really important. Because if it was truly a social virtue to claim that men and women can transition to the opposite gender or sex, this number should behave like all the other social virtues, like granting a woman the right to vote, making homosexuality legal, and granting gays the right to get married. Since before 1924, when women were granted the right to vote, support for equal rights for women has grown. I would challenge anyone to find one person who thinks that a woman should not vote. The same thing for making homosexuality legal. I would challenge anyone to find one person who thinks that that shouldn't be legal. The same goes for gay marriage. A study by Gallup illustrates that there's consistently growing support for gay marriage. Support for these social causes has grown since the laws changed to include rights for this group. But for some reason, support for the transgender issues are moving in the opposite direction. What? Okay, so the next place we should look would be to see if there's a study that measures the rise and fall of subcultures over time. This way, if we notice that there have been subcultures consistently falling in and out of vogue, but with an unexplained gap from 2010 onward, then we can say, aha, transgender must be the gap. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, there doesn't appear to be such a study. If you know of one, definitely send it my way. I'm not sure how you would even study that, perhaps by measuring the mentions of each subculture in popular media and graphing the data by year. However, what I did find were a few articles, including one in The Guardian from 2014, observing that subcultures are on the decline. The last 10 years since this article was published seem to add to the proof that subcultures might be a thing of the past. Subcultures used to be obvious to spot. In the 1940s, folk music, jazz, and the American gangster was a glorified subculture. In the 1950s, it was rock and roll, gang culture, and the idea of teenage music. In the 60s, it was beatnik, hippies, bikers, and the 1967 Summer of Love. In the 70s, it was disco, skinheads, and homosexuality once it became legal. In the 80s, it was rap, breakdancing, and punk rock with an androgynous vibe. In the 90s, it was internet cafes and grunge and anti-globalization. In the 21st century, it was goth, then emo, then heavy metal made a comeback. But since then, what has there been? Electronic music made a comeback in 2010, but that wasn't exactly a subculture. That was kind of mainstream. So what's happening now? Where's the subculture? Where did the emos and the goths go? And who replaced them? Where's the people that push boundaries and reel against the mainstream? I think two things have happened. With the proliferation of information and technology, you can find a subculture for almost every individual aspect of your life. You can be a man who likes sugary drinks, loves airplanes, but hates to drive. What subculture is that? It isn't a single subculture at all. It's a hyper-personalization. We no longer need subcultures to feel like we belong. There's so much personalization that we can just get exactly what we want when we want it. There's no need to belong to a group to get what we need when we can order it on the internet or order it to our door. So I don't think we have a need for subcultures anymore. And I think that they'll become increasingly rare. This brings me to the second thing. I think the day of the subculture oriented around music and fashion is done. You can get fashion and music personalized to your unique needs. I think we've entered a new era where subculture is oriented around social injustice. Hence the woke movements. It started with Black Lives Matter. Tons of white people were fighting for BLM justice. What do white people have to do with BLM? The social injustice. Like I said earlier, we have everything we could want at our fingertips, except social justice. The same thing goes for the transgender movement. As I said earlier, 40% of people believe that someone can be a different gender than their birth sex. That's a subculture. A subculture is a cultural group within a larger culture, often having benefits or interests at variance with those in the larger culture. Does that not sound like the transgender movement? It sure does to me. Here's one more point before I move on to the good and the bad of the transgender movement. There's a concept called symbolic interactionalism. I know the name sounds dumb, but it's pretty interesting. Check it out. Symbolic interactionalism addresses the subjective meanings that we impose on each other. People behave based on what they believe to be true, not what is objectively true. This is called symbolic interactionalism. You can say something to me like, "It's cruel to say that someone can't change their gender." And since I don't want to be cruel, I believe that someone can change their gender. In other words, the interpretation and the definition of our society is constructed through human interaction. These interpretations are called the definition of the situation. ThoughtCo creates a great example of this. Why would young people smoke cigarettes even when all the objective medical evidence points to the dangers of doing so? The answer is in the definition of the situation that people create. Studies find that teenagers are well informed about the risks of tobacco, but they also think that smoking is cool. They think they'll be safe from harm, and they think that smoking cigarettes projects a positive image to their peers. So the symbolic meaning of smoking cigarettes overrides the facts regarding smoking and risk. Now, smoking isn't exactly a subculture, but it was a significant part of a few of them, including punk, rock, and the biker scene. But you can take this theorem and you can apply it to other things, like transgenderism. Now, we objectively know that a trans woman is not a real woman, but it feels good to be kind to people who ask for us to say that they are. It can also attain us social clout by advocating for transgender causes. Conversely, we also feel fear or guilt when we oppose causes that may impair someone's desires. Because most media outlets lean left, we're constantly hearing about communities and institutions advocating for trans rights. The symbolic meaning of trans women being real women overrides the facts regarding sex and gender. Just like the smoking example. You can see this in the Pew research. Simply knowing someone who is transgender massively skews the opinion of whether gender can be different than sex assigned at birth. Hence, knowing someone who is transgender shifts our definition of the situation. In my opinion, the way to correct this is by continuing to push back and call people out for their BS. Essentially what I'm saying is, the more we let people gaslight us, the more we believe the lie. Okay, I've given it my best shot to prove to you that the transgender movement is an in vogue subculture. I do think it's starting to go out of style, and like all subcultures, there are good and bad things that it's leaving behind. Let's start with some of the good things. I think the most obvious one is that it created awareness of a very small population of people that wouldn't have otherwise been given a second thought. If someone feels like they're the wrong gender, that can be a problem. There's now research being done in this field to try to understand why someone would feel this way. This can lead to proper treatments and medication that can hopefully ease the discomfort of someone who feels this way. In the meantime, cross-dressing is now acceptable in many places. In the absence of medication to fix someone's discomfort, it's a type of self-medication. It's a non-invasive method of treating mental health. It makes a transgender person feel good, and since it doesn't harm them or others, knock yourself out. Another good thing that came out of the transgender movement is sexual freedom and experimentation. If you don't feel comfortable welcoming your sexual or gender preferences today, then there's probably nothing that'll make you feel comfortable. There are literally large support communities that welcome these individuals with open arms. Unfortunately for this subculture, there are a lot of negatives. Without these negatives, there would be nothing wrong with it. No one would have anything to complain about. But the negatives do exist, and they're not trivial either. The most obvious issue with this is that it gaslights all of us to say that a trans man or a trans woman is a real man or a real woman. They aren't. It's one thing to cross-dress. It's a completely different thing to say that because a man puts on a dress, he's now a woman. Is that all a woman is? If so, that's pretty degrading, and perhaps these folks should go tell that to the first and second wave feminists who fought for 150 years for the right to be so much more than that. The second issue with the transgender movement is that it fosters so much anger between opposing viewpoints. I plan to do a whole episode on this. The growing intolerance of someone with an opposing viewpoint is becoming toxic. This isn't unique to the transgender movement, but if you bring any opposition to a woke discussion, the risk of being screamed at or shunned is massive. The third issue with the transgender movement is that it degrades women when a man says he can be a real woman. Women fought to shed these stereotypes, like belonging in the kitchen or serving as eye candy. When a transgender man transitions, he does so because he wants the stereotype. To say that a woman is just a stereotype is pretty disrespectful. The fourth and the probably most horrific issue is that the subculture makes it acceptable to castrate boys and give mastectomies to girls. Check this out.
So with cross-sex hormones, some of the permanent changes would be, like you mentioned, my voice. I've developed an Adam's apple. My vocal cords have thickened. I suffered some head hair loss, lots of body hair growth. Taking the testosterone for as long as I did, which was just over 4.5 years, has led to bladder problems. And obviously the surgery is irreversible, so I'm almost completely numb on my chest area.
You had your breasts removed?
Yeah, I got a double mastectomy when I was 26. But fortunately for me, after the double mastectomy, I kind of had that realization where I was like, what if I do go the full way and I still hate myself like this? I didn't need hormones or surgery, I needed therapy.
These stories are heartbreaking. With no research and other professionals too scared to stand in their way, surgeons are breaking their Hippocratic oath to do no harm. When these folks mature and realize their mistake, the medical profession abandons them. It's devastating, and an abuse of the medical profession's authority, to be frank. Doctors who do this should be in jail. Finally, the last one on my list is that this ideology is being taught in schools. With COVID forcing kids to learn from home, I saw it myself over a year ago when a teacher was teaching my 10-year-old son about gender fluidity. 10-year-olds are confused enough about sex and relationships. They don't need to be taught that they could also be the opposite sex. Aside from there being almost no research on the topic, it confuses the hell out of adults. How do you expect a 10-year-old to perceive this? Like I said when I began, fads have good and bad traits, and they come and go. Unfortunately, this one's had a lot of bad. This is making us physically and mentally worse. You should never let someone gaslight or hurt you. But if someone in your community is struggling, lend a hand. Regardless of their preferences or their views, maybe that's all we need, is to be reminded that we're just all a little bit different. Think about that.